Why do people play old video games? Newer games must surely be better, right? Well, they certainly seem to cost more for companies to develop, but with that, a lot of the simple elegance that makes retro games so great is lost. You see, these old games are designed around the idea that you can just pick up and play them. They don't need updates, they don't have extra DLC you gotta buy. You just pop them in and you're off to the races. Easy. But you know what's not easy? The difficulty of a lot of these games. Game developers weren't as worried about a person being able to make it through to the end of their game, because games weren't as mainstream back then as they are now. That, combined with the influence of the difficulty of arcade games, which were big at the time, made for a lot of pretty challenging games. That meant that beating a game back then meant something different than it does for most games now. It's an accomplishment, and I've seen people get pretty fired up when they beat a tough retro game. But it wasn't just the difficulty. The games looked a lot different back then as well. Games were predominantly 2D, at least until the mid-90s that is. And that made for some really wonderful hand-drawn sprite work and what a lot of people like to call pixel art. Now, pixel art hasn't died as it has remained popular in new games, but the difference is that in newer games it has mostly been indie developers making this stuff. Whereas in the early 90s you had the designers who were at the top of the industry working on this stuff. 2D sprites were the dominant visual format back then, and you had all the top artists trying to outdo each other. This 2D style still looks really great today, and will probably always look great going forward. In this respect, it's timeless, and what better compliment could be given to a game than that? Think about it, which sounds better? I'm gonna play a game that is a timeless classic, or I'm gonna play a game that I won't care about in a few years. A lot of people who only play modern games become uninterested in the games they play as soon as they are no longer new enough. If a game is truly great, then it should be great forever. That's not to say something can't be enjoyed as a product of its time, but it is different. And that's another thing. Most people who play retro games also play newer games as well. They are fans of video games first and foremost, and a big part of that is appreciating the history, which includes being able to recognize and appreciate the classics that are still awesome. Now, it's hard to get around the nostalgia involved in all of this, and some will argue that people only like old games because of this nostalgia. It's a powerful thing and can make something you have good memories with feel really special. I don't think it's a problem though, and it may not be as big of a factor as it might seem. You see, a lot of people will go back to an old system and games they had as a kid when they feel nostalgic, but the ones who really get into retro gaming find joy in discovering and playing the stuff they never got a chance to or maybe hadn't even heard of. This creates feelings like, man, I didn't get to play this as a kid, but now I know about it and I'm finally able to play it. This process can feel like a real renaissance. The themes and characters were generally a lot different back then as well. This is due in large part to the fact that games were mostly developed by Japanese development teams. Western game development has progressed a long way since then, but back then it was almost entirely Japanese development. At least most of the more notable stuff was. As a result, you saw different types of games being emphasized, and this is really apparent if you take a look at who the main characters in a lot of the games are. Most of the main characters had something quirky about them to make them unique. This stands out compared to a lot of the generic human dude characters that became more popularized as time went on. I know it's a little more difficult to try to relate to a blue hedgehog that wears red sneakers, but I do think it's easier to be a fan of a character like that. There were a much higher volume of great games from your favorite developers back then too, and this is in large part due to the shorter development times required for games. Nowadays, a big budget AAA game can take years and years to make, and let's face it, waiting for a game you're excited about sucks. So do yourself a favor if you haven't already, and look back instead of looking forward the next time you're waiting for a big release to come out. Jump into some retro games and appreciate what this great form of media has to offer.